welcome to everyone, and especially to our guests. We are so happy to have you here. Natasha Kaul, Sahar Saba, Noura Al-Khalili and Emma Brenlund. And Emma will be the moderator of this conversation, so she will soon introduce the speakers a bit more. I just want to say welcome on behalf of the magazine Mana, which is an anti-racist magazine based here in Malmö. We come out with 4 issues every year, working around different themes from an anti-racist, intersectional, feminist perspective. And we have a lot of focus on Sweden, but we also always try to include global issues of both racism and nationalism and militarism. In our latest issue, that has the theme, the thematic part is about the law and issues of juridification and anti-racist activism. But outside of the thematic part, we have the pleasure to have a translation of a text by Natasha, who is here today. I'll try to find it to show it. Yeah. Yeah. We. Yeah, so we have a reworked and translated piece of Natasha in the latest issue, and we will also link to the English version on our website, I think. So today we wanted to gather some amazing people for a conversation about building solidarity alliances from the left, conditions of resistance, to think about conditions of resistance in different specific contexts, but also think about and share ideas about commonalities and ways of building solidarity alliances between these contexts, and also here from a left located in the Western Europe. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here in this heat. We're really happy to have you here. And Talat will now say something about the organization that also part of organizing this event.
Yeah, hey, NORDIC Kashmir organization is a small organization. 4 years ago we started in Stockholm, and it's to give the awareness of Kashmir conflict and in Nordic countries. So if anybody need more information, there's short information here. So we do activities and awareness in academics or by all means. So it's, please, if anybody needs information about what we're doing, please here. Thank you.
Yes, and Mana, we also have an info table outside, so if you, after this talk, want to know more about the magazine or sign up for a subscription, you're welcome to come out there and talk to us.
Yeah. I just want to add is the next event is organized by NORDIC Kashmir organization, and it's Feminist Perspective of Kashmir. And it's just after 15 minutes of this event. So Emma Brenlund, actually she is from Sweden, and she did a PhD on Kashmir 2 years ago, and she's teaches now right now in Bristol University. And then Natasha Cole will share it with her. So please stay after. You can go out, have a cup of coffee, and come back in 15 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, so I leave the word to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mana, for inviting us today, for organizing this event. It's been a lovely weekend so far here at the Feminist Festival, and so it's great to be in Malmö, and it's great to be back in Sweden. It's not very often that I'm in Sweden, so it's always really exciting. So hi, my name is Emma Brenlund. I'm the chair for this event. I'm a lecturer at the University of West of England in Bristol. And but here today I'm going to take a very small role. I'm just going to ask a few questions. I'm going to let our very experienced and insightful speakers take the main stage. So thank you all for coming today. It's such a pleasure to see so many people here, despite the beautiful weather outside. And so with us today, our guest, we have Noura Al-Khalili. She did a PhD in Human Geography here at Lund University. And her research interests concern colonial and post-colonial and decolonial studies, critical geography, urban studies, and political ecology. We also have Sahar Saba. She's an activist and teacher from Afghanistan. She has worked with Rava and other groups both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And we also have Natasha Cole. She's a Kashmiri novelist and researcher and academic. and she's Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at Westminster University. So thank you all for coming today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Mana, the journal, invited us today to talk about exploring the different conditions and experiences of occupations in various sites, and to start a conversation about how we can build solidarity across borders, across different contexts, both across women's movements, feminist movements, anti-colonialist movements. So in order to do this, we first need to start unpacking what we actually mean by occupation. So I would like to invite you, our speakers today, to tell us a little bit about your context, the context of occupation at your respective sites. Can you tell us a little bit about the political context? What are the key issues at stake in Afghanistan, Palestine, and Kashmir, respectively? And what are the impacts of the occupation on the general population? So do you know where I want to start a little bit?
Hello? Oh. So thank you for coming. So yeah, I will speak on Palestine. I think most of us maybe are familiar with Palestine more or less, but maybe there is more focus on the occupation, the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1967. But I think it's important to bring it back to the main structural impositions and dominations, and here I would go back to the early 20th century, late 19th century with the early Zionist settlements in Palestine. So basically to talk about the Zionist settler colonial project and the domination that has created the State of Israel in 1948, and I would say the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967 of what remained of historical Palestine, and of course the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967, which 1980 it started following the Israeli laws and it was against the international community. So that's very important, I think, from the lens that we look at Palestine, and not just to be stuck in the fragmentation of this history. So the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is part of it, I would say. It's not the only thing, because then we forget what's happening inside of Israel now with the Palestinians who are residing in Israel as second-class citizens. Yeah, so what would I say? I mean, of course, it's hard to... I wouldn't want to say that what's happening in West Bank is different from what's happening in Gaza, or what's happening in East Jerusalem is different from what's happening inside of Israel. They're all products of the settler colonial project, but of course there are different implications on the everyday life. And like you have in Gaza Strip, we all know the closure on Gaza since 2006, and East Jerusalem is going under systematic displacement on a daily basis. Palestinians are being kicked out of their city of centuries due to the Judaization of the city, while West Bank is under daily military impositions of arrests and house demolitions. That's also in East Jerusalem. Inside of Israel, of course, Palestinians are struggling under a racist state as second-class citizens, and their struggle is how to maintain their presence in their own land. And of course, I mean, so that's to start with, let's say. So I leave the rest for the others.
Thank you so much. Do you, Sahai, want to tell us a little bit about Afghanistan?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this event today, and unfortunately what we have in common is occupation. Maybe it's a little bit different in Afghanistan or Kashmir or in Palestine, but we, I think, are very well aware of one other situation. In Afghanistan especially, Palestine has been a big issue. But talking about Afghanistan, I cannot go so back in history, but the last more than 30 years, I can say Afghanistan has been under occupation. Many of you may know that first it was invaded by the Russians. In the 10 years that the Afghan people, especially women, suffered, it's a tragedy and a different topic to talk about. But if we talk about the occupations of USA in NATO forces in 2001, it's very, very important to see and to take it seriously, because this occupation didn't happen, or many don't consider it as occupation even in Afghanistan, unfortunately, because it happened in the name of liberation of women and women's rights, more importantly. But the consequences and what happened in the last 16 years or more, it has no difference. It is occupation, because everything and everyone is occupied in Afghanistan under in the devastated and very destructive consequences that this occupation has brought to Afghanistan. I don't have time to talk about and give you examples of how women have suffered as a result of this occupation, how children, how people in general. But the most dangerous side of this occupation has been to impose the most dangerous misogynist fundamentalist, religious Islamic fundamentalist. That is the dangerous part. So the Afghan people, it's not just the occupation for them, but also the fundamentalists who are in power and those who are like Taliban and the ISIS, which are in different parts of Afghanistan. This is really, really important when we talk about the occupation or the US presence or the international community, as they call it. So it's not that simple. It is not, we all know by now that we don't need to emphasize, but they are not there. They have not been there to rescue or to help the Afghan people or Afghan women. We all know that they were there and are there and don't want to leave because they have their own interests there. And that is why they never think about the development of Afghanistan, the security. According to their own reports, 75% of Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban, directly or indirectly. So violence against women, killing, corruption, drug problem in Afghanistan, drug production. So it's really Afghanistan, which in 1970s or maybe 60s were on the way to development or progress. It turned to a devastated country, a country that is dependent economically, socially, politically, and has no, majority of people have no hope really for the future. There is so much to talk about, how it is or the implication of occupation for its people, but maybe for the others.
Thank you so much.
So I was just listening to my fellow panelists, and we have had some preceding conversations too, and thinking about what it is that I can possibly convey to you if I had to say in 5 minutes, what the occupation of Kashmir is or feels like. So no doubt you would be able to get the facts elsewhere. So before telling you about the facts, let me just try and draw together some of the things that I think are very palpably present in a place like Kashmir, but also in many of these other zones of occupation. So I think there's a fundamental dehumanization of the population which extends right down to the everyday and everything that a person can do. And this dehumanization, which is mostly people experience it at the hands of a heavily militarized, at the hands of soldiers in a heavily militarized atmosphere. So Kashmir is one of the most militarized places in the world. Some people say the most militarized. So the number of soldiers or armed forces personnel stationed there per number of population is something like between 7 and 10, one soldier for 7 and 10 people. So there is a dehumanization. There is a coloniality of power in an occupation, like in Kashmir, which is to say that there is a lack of accountability. There is a lack of people having to be made to answer for things. So in Kashmir, for example, since the 1990s till now, for 28 years, there have been emergency powers, which are called laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA it's called, which gives the armed forces impunity even in cases where civilians are killed. So not a single armed forces personnel has been prosecuted because they are in effect given immunity by an emergency power, but that emergency power is imposed ostensibly because it was an emergency, is still in place 28 years later. So there is a way in which that lack of accountability and the coloniality in the way in which power is exercised is very systematic. There is also, of course, common to all occupations and also in Kashmir, a gendered, the way in which the occupation ties in with a gendered hierarchy of the occupier and the occupied being seen in terms of an asymmetrical relationship where the occupied are feminized, which is to say their landscape is seen in exoticized and feminized terms, but also their bodies are seen as feminine bodies and in line with that deeply misogynist idea to be dominated and controlled. So this is why, for example, men, especially in the 90s, young boys and men, were tortured and humiliated in torture camps and torture centers. Papa 2 was a famous one. And like with Abu Ghraib and other places, these acts are systematic, whether they are in the Kashmir case, they were mostly perpetrated by men, unlike in the Abu Ghraib case. But the idea is similar in the sense of dominating and humiliating the opponent. And also explicit cases of gendered violence where women being not only the victims of their family members being victims of enforced disappearances and left in stages like half widows when they don't know whether they have the person that they are with or not, whether that person is alive or not, but also things like explicit use of sexual violence as a weapon in conflict. So the cases of, in particular, something called two villages called Kunan and Poshpura. So Kunan, Poshpura, the mass rapes in those villages that were carried out by a specific unit, and they have these things have still gone like these. There are no closures for these people. So if for example, if you were interested in Kunan, Poshpura, there's a recent book that's that some young women of Kashmiri young women have put together about it. So there's that. There's also, of course, again with occupation, a whole litany of vested interests that come to become deeply entrenched over time. So that to take any other different position, which involves more negotiation or understanding or demilitarization, goes against entrenched interests that link to profit through corruption in conflict or through weapons trade or other such kinds of entrenched interests. There's also the use of this understanding of democracy as something that makes everything okay, the word democracy. So in Kashmir you would have sometimes elections in constituencies where there would be less than 5% voter turnout. And it would still be seen as, okay, well there are elections and there is a democracy, even if a whole range of leaders do not take part in that. There's also the idea of security for Kashmiris. The idea of those who provide them security actually end up making their lives much more insecure. Again, something common to all occupations. So the last 2 days especially, I mean, this is something, of course, that's ongoing, but just 2 days ago, a Kashmiri protester three protesters were crushed under the wheels of a Central Reserve Police Forces vehicle, and one of them succumbed to his injuries and died. This is not unusual. A few weeks ago, a security vehicle changed course and ran over a protester. Last year, a civilian Kashmiri man was used as a human shield by an Indian Army major who was later awarded by the Indian government for his bravery. I mean, the major was awarded. So in the wider context of, of at least what is happening in India since 2014, so Kashmiris have always, of course, faced Indian nationalism in this occupying sense. But since 2014, of course, it's sort of stepped up in the range of violence. And so what is occupied, in fact, is the land, is the way in which politics is thought to be constructed around women and women's bodies and questions of gender. But it's also an occupation in the sense that people's histories are occupied. They cannot lay claim to their own histories. Their memories are occupied. They cannot talk about their own memories, freely. Their everyday life, their movements, everything is part of that, the monster of an occupation, which is both palpable, real and material, but also in all sorts of ways internalized and, part of how people experience their life.
Thank you so much. Does anybody want to add something to somebody? Okay, so that's really interesting. I think it's very interesting to see how this dehumanization is taking place in the three different contexts through various forms of political projects, through settler colonialism, through forced nationalism, and in terms of an intervention in the name of liberal democracy and freedom and war against terror. So when we're looking here at the various dynamics and relations of occupation in these different sites, and you described a little bit about the impact it has had on the population. Can you tell us a little bit about the resistance that is taking place against these various forms of occupation? How the resistance movements organized, what alliances are being formed or have been formed, and what are the different experiences of the people on the ground? Does somebody else want to start? You want to start, Sahar?
Of course, I mean, when there is occupation, there is resistance, no doubt. But in Afghanistan, again, it may be a bit different from Palestine and Kashmir due to Afghanistan special situation in the complication of occupation in Afghanistan. Because if we, and also it's hard to define resistance in that situation. So if we talk about resistance in formal sense, unfortunately, for example, if there are very strong political parties in opposition or political parties who stood up to the occupation, unfortunately, there are not. We don't have our... to have a resistance, we need to have a strong civil society, which unfortunately doesn't exist in Afghanistan. You have heard, of course, we have hundreds or maybe thousands of organizations, both international and national NGOs, which are active, but they cannot be considered as resistant to the occupation, because majority of these organizations and NGOs are going according to the policies and the vision or the interest of those who are funding them. So you would hardly hear any voice from them against occupation, against the US, NATO, or the presence of international community in Afghanistan. Yeah, this is really unfortunate, and also there is the complicated side of resistance in Afghanistan for us, the people, is that we have to resist or to struggle to fight against the so-called resistance against the occupation. And by this I mean that Taliban, for example, unfortunately by some considered resistant to the US occupation. And this is really, again, the dangerous side of when we talk about Afghanistan in the situation, because there is no way that forces so reactionary, so misogynist, so brutal, so inhuman can be a resistance to an occupation. They have never been, and they cannot be. They have only, both the Taliban and the US occupation, in fact, have justified each other's presence in Afghanistan. USA and their alliance are there because they want to fight the Taliban, and Taliban are there, they claim that, to fight the occupation, and none of them really are the interest of Afghan people. So in between, it is we, the people, the women and children, who suffer because of it. But as I said, there are no such big, strong political resistance, if we talk in that sense, but there are some small parties, some organizations, some committees of resistance which are trying in terms of their own resources and whatever they can. So they have protests, they have They have raised their voice against the occupation despite big threats and risks to their lives, but they have raised their voice. But there's also another side to resistance, and that is, we can say, informal resistance of especially women and the people of Afghanistan, the everyday struggle of the people. And for me, coming from Afghanistan, for me, resistance, one big example, if I can give you, is if as a girl, as a woman, we are able to get our right to go to school and get education or get work, or to be able to do that and stand for our rights. So that is really resistance in order to continue living in Afghanistan. Some of us tried to turn this kind of resistance into more organized way, and I have worked with one such organization that you mentioned, RAWA, which is the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, and they have been struggling, fighting, resisting since 1977 up till now in different ways to raise political awareness, to really give a different voice to the resistance movement of Afghanistan. I can say that RAWA has been the only organization that was for secular democracy in Afghanistan, against the fundamentalists and against the occupation. So to organize ourselves in different ways in very dangerous situation, even as underground organization, it has played a big role in contribution, I think, when it comes to resistance and fight, feminist fights in Afghanistan against occupation, or against, I must say, against religious extremism and fundamentalism.
So resistance in Palestine, wow, that's where to start, from which fragmented territory. I think the first thing I could say, Palestinians are stubborn and we want to stay, we will not leave. And I think that's very important to be reminded of the stubbornness of Palestinians, their sumud, their steadfastness to stay on the land. Because the Zionist settler colonial project, what it wants is the territory, the land, all the land of Palestine, and basically the cancellation of the Palestinians. And that's happening on an everyday basis. But that's not enough, of course. We can't just say we're there, we're resisting, life goes on. And of course there's a lot of history to the Palestinian resistance, and I don't know how much you're familiar, so I can't go through everything. And there are different scales, and there are different, like, politically organized, or more like, we know the intifadas, especially the first intifada, the uprising. But I think if I can speak now, I think it's important for any struggle to think, where are we now, and not to take the movement for liberation or decolonization for granted. And to question, where are we heading, and what's our political agenda, and how could we anticipate the future. And especially, I can speak like now in Palestine, and these are my, let's say, my own views, so perhaps I don't represent all the Palestinian people. There is a loss of direction in the Palestinian struggle, and there's, like, the struggle is quite fractured and divided. So not just the land, but also the struggle of the people. And I would say mostly after the first intifada has been, which is a very important moment for Palestine, because it was organized collectively from the ground, from below, and it was based on basically non-violent resistance against the Israeli occupation and colonization of land, and it was very strategically organized. And somehow it was shut down by the Oslo Agreement, the peace process in 1993 between Palestine and Israel, and the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which I would say that the Palestinian Authority is another byproduct of the settler colonial project. It came as a subcontractor to serve the occupation. even though, I mean, there were these talks about let's have a Palestinian state, create your own autonomy on the 67 borders, which is West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state, and that was the whole scenario of a two-state solution. But I mean, the Palestinian Authority, just to make it clear, came as a subcontractor to the occupation because the occupation did not know what to do with this population of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and and East Jerusalem. They didn't want to grant them citizenship, as what happened to the Palestinians of Israel. Now they were granted citizenship, so they needed somebody to take care of the population, to administer their civic and issues, and to provide security coordination to Israel, to somehow empower the occupation, and to create an economic dependent, like we became economically dependent on Israel. We're completely dependent on Israel, and the land kept with Israel. There was no autonomy for the Palestinians over the land, and so this failed. As much as they tried, the West still talk about negotiations, two-state solution. This does not exist anymore. And anyone who talks about two-state solution is like, come on people, wake up. There's no two-state solution. There's no land for the Palestinian state. There's an ongoing settler colonial domination that takes different forms. And the Oslo brought with it a break in the collective struggle. I mean, it was based on collective struggle for the liberation of the land, and it has become concerned with an institutionalized idea of creating a state. So we became concerned with a state. We forgot that there's a land that we're struggling for, and then it became the institution of the state. And this has brought also the Oslo Agreement, this neoliberal thought and lifestyle that we assumed we are like free because we live in our cantons, enclaves, and we have the international development coming and the NGOs. This created a new class formation, people profiting from that also, and most of the people were marginalized, but still people became dependent on law. So this killed the need to struggle. Basically, you became dependent on an economic system that is failed, that is quite illusionary. And also the whole idea to compromise, to negotiate with the colonizer, you know, that's also killed. It somehow brought to the fore as if we're two equal partners, but we're not, because they are the colonizers, we're the colonized, they are the oppressors, we're the oppressed. So this is a very asymmetrical game. So this, let's say, has really created a loss in the Palestinian struggle, even though we still see moments of resistance, like people basically demonstrate, especially if you're directly affected. I'm not saying there's no struggle, there's no resistance, but it's really fragmented. And but we should be reminded what happened lastly in Gaza with the March of Return from 30th of March until now, like in the past weeks. This is something I think is happening now. People are becoming again collectively organized from below. It's a mass struggle focused on the return. People want to return to their land. So it's becoming back the return to the land, the liberation, the decolonization of the land. It's not politicized like it's led by one political party, it's led by the people. And I think this is something that I was thinking of recently. There's a sort of maybe move now towards collective from below, the land, the return to the land, and not just the state, the institution of the state, the 67 borders, or negotiations and all these little bits. There are everyday struggles also and resistance in villages against the illegal expansion of the settlements, the dispossession of land, and the farmers not being allowed to go to their land, and people not being allowed to go to their schools. And I mean, these are everyday resistances, but I think it's important to think of a collective one, and we need new leadership and a new political agenda and more focus on the decolonization project of the land, of the bodies, of the, yeah, not just us, it has to be on everybody's responsibility, I think. We can talk later about it. So this is something I can share now.
Thank you. So in the context of Kashmir, there are the resistance would be to, so there are two issues which are often conflated and not, one of them is often not recognized. There's an issue of human rights, which, you would have, okay, some international actors willing to recognize that, on occasion people recognizing that. But then there's the other issue, which is an issue of it being a political problem, which is the one that's harder to get the interested parties to recognize, that beyond the human rights violations, there's also the fact that this is disputed land. This is a political problem. On 14th and 15th of August 1947, when India and Pakistan come into being as post-colonial nations, the territory of Kashmir, or that state of erstwhile state of Kashmir, is not part of either. So at that point it doesn't belong to either India or Pakistan. And today, if you see a map, there is a line of control, as a result of successive wars, that the territory has become divided and and occupied by these two neighboring nations. Some people would say administered, others would say occupied. I would say certainly they have been forcibly bracketed into these two neighboring nations, and these, and in effect that land and the people have been occupied. So there is a resistance in the sense of documenting and creating the evidence for the human rights abuses. That is resistance too. It's memorialization of, like, okay, these are the abuses, these are the instances of mass graves, these are the testimonies of the women. So there's a lot of work in civil society organizations that resists by doing this, work done by JKCCS, Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, or APDP, Association of Parents of Disappeared People, which is led by Parveena Ahangar, who's her son was a victim of enforced disappearances, and she set up this organization, and she's campaigned for over 2 decades now. And on the 10th of every month, they hold a vigil in the center of the city in Pratap Park to draw, where the parents of these people who have been disappeared gather and keep that memory alive of, through the struggle of what's going on, because 8,000 to 10,000 people have been the victims of enforced disappearances, not to mention the tens of thousands that have been killed. So there's that kind of resistance, which is relating to human rights. And then there is the sort of the political type resistance. So there are the two main political parties that are part of the political mainstream and contest elections, do not really have a huge amount of support from the people. There is a set of other parties, which are called Hurriyat parties, which do not take part in the electoral process because they do not recognize the fact that the elections as a legitimate thing, because these are in effect elections conducted by India. And these are the parties that are in the Indian discourse. You would find reference to them as separatists. They're called separatists by Indians. So these political parties have, so when there are assassinations or killings or other such instances where protesters are killed or fired upon, then typically these are the parties that would give calls for shutdowns, and then be met with curfews. So there is a constant state of besiegedness which the population lives under. Curfews, being besieged at any instance, whatever. If the government decides they can just switch off the internet, and I literally mean that, like your phones do not work, you cannot do anything, they just become little plastic boxes. The internet can just be snapped off if the population has to be cut off. The news from Kashmir does not filter through to India in the same way. So there's all that kind of resistance, which is to keep responding to these things. And then beyond that, there is histories of Kashmir can be told from different starting points, and you would have different histories for different purposes. But certainly a key moment was 1846, when the British bought and sold the territory, and through what was called the Treaty of Amritsar. And that was subsequently, the region was ruled by a Dogra king who was repressive and also not very representative. And that Dogra rule was hugely repressive and feudal and problematic throughout much of the 19th century. So there was resistance by peasants and weavers, and that kind of class-based resistance. And these are some of the earliest examples of this resistance happening in this way anywhere in the world. If you think about even the welfare state and all that, in generally it's the same sort of time. Then early 20th century, early to mid 20th century, various progressive movements in Kashmir. So that kind of resistance. So in the early years of the Cold War, it was seen as a worrisome place in the Cold War context, as a place of red fear, red threat and fear because of the communist sort of progressive policy there. Subsequently, you have a whole through the decades various kinds of resistance organizations of different kinds. Then in 1980s, that is the phase at which the Pakistan supported aspects of the resistance come into play a lot more significantly, and it becomes more Islamized. That then results in the Indian state responding to it in the 1990s, like I said, with through the 90s in the worst way possible. But for the present, the important moment to note is that from 2008, 2010 onwards roughly, there is something different happened in that now the resistance is not about Pakistan supported militants or like, the earlier kind of resistance. Now the resistance is, the mainstay of that resistance now is a generation of people who've just grown up with knowing nothing other than the conflict. The children of the late 80s and early 90s. So these who would be 20-year-olds in 2010 in that summer was known as Kashmir's Intifada. So in Kashmir there's a lot of awareness of and solidarity with Palestine. And so that was that summer when the uprising in 2010 summer was set off by a small boy, Tufel Matu, whose head exploded because of a grenade. And he was just on his way, near a football field. So these kinds of instances happen in Kashmir, and it just draws attention to the egregious nature. So anybody who tells you that these are just Islamic radicals is being disingenuous at least and toxic at the worst, because this is really about these sorts of instances that set things off. That summer, over 100 young people, children, many of them minors, almost all of them men, but some women too, were killed. Like the Palestinian context, they often throw stones. So the figure of the stone pelter comes into public consciousness in a very significant way from then on. These stone pelters who throw stones at soldiers with guns are then met with fire, or either firing, or as in 2016 summer when they were met with pellet guns. They use pellet guns which nowhere else in the world have been used on human beings. So these pellet guns were they resulted in mass blindings. Large numbers of people were blinded because their eyes were targeted. So there's also an active attempt to create vulnerability in that population through the use of this kind of technologies of responding to protest. And so, but that doesn't stop. I mean, but the earlier generation of Kashmiris themselves look at stone pelters, and this young generation of people who do not have the same kind of fear of death, because and they don't, because they live their lives under this knowledge that they can be killed at any time for various things that that may have nothing to do with what they were doing. So that arbitrary use of power, and in that way, in that colonial way, means that there is a whole aspect now of indigenous resistance, at the forefront of which are the youth mainly, who are then responded to with a lot of brutality, and then there's the kind of resistance which is around commemoration. So like Kashmiri Women's Resistance Day and other kinds of. So there's also a memorialization kind of resistance to keep those instances of specific instances where, like I said, KASHMIRI or other struggles or massacres from the 90s. So to keep that memory alive. There's that resistance as well through the memories. The one, I guess, last point I would like to make in this context is that in the Kashmir case, and I have written out so you can sort of read the argument in more detail, but I do want to point out to you, because yesterday there was another funeral, is that there is no difference between a funeral and a demonstration in the case of Kashmir. So you have people who demonstrate, deaths result from that, the funerals of those who are killed, then are become again venues of this exchange of fire. Not exchange of fire. Sorry, firing by the police, because the crowds are there, and in fact large numbers of people. So the funeral becomes a very important site, as through which funerals and demonstrations sort of fold into each other. And this cycle continues, and summers are especially worst, because every summer just brings with it this whole kind of, we don't know, for example, right now we are at the start of June and we don't know what the next 3 months will bring, but it's like the summers are the worst for these cycles of violence.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for really succinctly trying to describe these very complex sites with long histories, and there's a lot of nuance, and obviously it's so difficult to get all the nuance in such a short time. So I'm going to ask the last question, but at the same time I'm aware that we only have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask my questions, but at the same time I'm also going to open up the floor to the audience if the audience has a question and has any questions. So first of all, I would like you to talk a little bit about how we can build solidarity between activists and movements in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, in Palestine. So you can think about that for a minute, but we can also at the same time see if there's anybody in the audience that has a question to any of the speakers. Otherwise, we can answer this question and then we hopefully have maybe a minute or two left. And if somebody has a question and want to think about it. Sure, okay. Who wants to start? Do you want to start, Natasha?
So there are good and bad solidarities. In terms of the important thing is to have solidarities that actually do not decenter the experiences of the people who are whose struggle this is about, and I think especially for this is true for for allies who may be there in India, but also especially true for people in Europe and elsewhere, is that we have to be aware of the ways in which we are people in Europe are intersected into this, both as people who might have who might care about a conflict, but also as people whose governments are part of the very mechanisms of development or something promotion or economies that are involved in there, through, for example, weapons trade or development infrastructure which helps the colonization process. So I think the process of inquiry for you, I imagine, would be also not just about these poor people are suffering, how do we save them, because of course, and I know you probably, that's not what you're thinking, but that it's important to be aware of that impulse and to resist that it's not about saving them, but about holding these wider global structures of power to account, even in our own immediate, with our own immediate representatives, with what our governments are doing and or not doing, or that they can do. So it's also like looking at all of those processes, and beyond that, obviously, to be as to try to be more and more aware of these things that are happening, which do affect us all in directly or indirectly, because many of these places of there's a direct way in which the struggles sometimes, of course, move beyond the borders. They don't respect the borders we draw, but then there's also the ways in which there's injustices are interconnected, and it's and it's important therefore to challenge that to be aware of the work of people who are working on Kashmir, to actually try to find out as much as you can yourself, to not think that there are any simple easy solutions, but to maybe grow and amplify the voices that move towards that sort of help us think of and imagine better alternatives, and I just think of the work of of those of us in the world, many of us who want to create more peace actively as gardeners. We just have to keep planting the seeds in other people's heads and their thoughts, like say, okay, you think about this, maybe nothing will grow, but maybe something will grow, and oftentimes things grow. So we just have to keep trying to grow those things, whether we are and it's not that we all have to be crusaders for Kashmir, but these struggles they all represent these common points around dehumanizing specific populations and making, as Judith Butler would say, their lives less grievable. We don't hear about what's happening to these people. Why do we not hear? If it was somewhere else, we would hear. So it's about constantly those very fundamental, basic kind of human principles that we have to keep foregrounding.
Thank you.
Not to repeat also. So yeah, I think to add on everything you said, decolonization should not just be the responsibility of the colonizer. That's very important to remind ourselves. So it shouldn't be work internally. Like in Palestine, we support the Palestinians. You do it alone internally. In Kashmir, in Afghanistan, I believe in also more of a there should be more of a global effort in that. And I don't have the mechanisms, but if I think of Palestine as an example, because I'm more informed of Palestine, like the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign is very important, and that works to isolate Israel academically, economically, and also, and that should be definitely supported, because it's Palestinians alone will not break the settler colonial project. And we shouldn't forget the political level. Of course, I believe in the power of the people, but I still believe in political powers, and there should be sanctions should be imposed on Israel, punishment to Israel because of all the war crimes, and Israel should stop all these massacres that are being conducted, and basically nobody's saying anything. So these things I think are very important also in the sense of when we speak of solidarity, or like it's the work of everyone. And of course we should think of how do we break all these hierarchies. So here I think we should connect between the anti-colonial, anti-capital, anti-racist struggles, and how do we bond among them. Because I also think when I look at Palestine, something that I've been thinking of, like Palestinians could be anti-colonial because that's their struggle, of course, but I think not everyone is anti-imperial or anti-capital maybe, you know, and which is okay, but I think there should be more linkages to these struggles and not just like to detach them. And I think we should definitely work along these lines. So I think solidarity has to be rethought and not just taken for granted as also a solidarity of the West to the South. That's something I also think lacks in Palestine. We are somehow, I'm a bit critical of our struggle and of ourselves. That's good. I think self-critique is very important. We're not so much aware of maybe of other struggles that are similar to us. There's this kind of closure, like we're the only occupied territory, and I think that's problematic. It's important to open up to other struggles, to connect to them, especially where there are similarities and commonalities, and how do we learn from each other, and what tactics do we use, and not just to talk to the West. Because I think there's a lot of effort in Palestine towards like talking to the West, look what's happening, look, we need your support. But I think there should be also more alliances with other contexts that we really have similar situations, and to share experiences, and how do we build that. So yeah, that's something, and I would be happy if there could be more thoughts. How do we connect anti-colonial, anti-capital, anti-racist, and all these struggles together? Of course, that's a big project, but I think that's how we break all these hierarchies and unite somehow, start somewhere. So.
Yeah, I think you both raise very important points, and I would not repeat them, but it's really important when you talk about the trial of war criminals, or the warlords as we call them in Afghanistan. And unfortunately there has been very little support in this regard, and it's very, very important, because if we could have brought those responsible for the destruction and human rights abuses in Afghanistan, Afghanistan would not have been in this condition today. So it's very, very important. The second point that you talked about is the involvement of many of the governments in Afghanistan, but also in other countries, including Sweden. So, and I would say that whatever happened or happening in Afghanistan, it is not just, you know, mostly it has been blamed on the people and the culture and the religion, and you know, these are backwards people, and it is, you know, you have, but I mean, there are internal factors, there are these problems, of course, but there is also huge responsibility on the side of these governments that, for many reasons, as you say, weapons are one of the things. So, for example, if Sweden has not directly sold or selling weapons to Afghanistan, but to Pakistan they do, and Pakistan is one of the countries very much involved in Afghanistan, or brutally involved in Afghanistan. So this is also one of the things that's very important, more than us you can raise and talk about it and pressurize the governments here. But also the other side is that which, when it comes to solidarity with the people or the women of Afghanistan, unfortunately there has been two very, how can I put it, not really real support and real solidarity, because all of a sudden Afghan people, especially women, are those burqa-clad women who needs to be rescued, and through those NGOs and those international community involvement and intervention or occupation in Afghanistan. So that is, I mean, the most focus especially has been on to support the NGOs, the so-called civil society, as they call them there, that has really practically has not really helped the situation to improve in Afghanistan for women, if we talk just about women. So this is really important for those who would like or who have interest to help and to raise their voices, to find, and there exist such voices which are different. It's not just through these NGOs or these liberal feminist struggle, or on the other side it is to find a solution for Afghanistan through the existing religious framework in Afghanistan, because oftentimes we have heard that when there is no interest in Afghanistan, this is your issue, this is your cultural sensitivity, as they call it, or I don't know, in academic, or there's cultural relativism, so it has nothing with us, you know, that is, or we cannot interfere because it's very, so these ideas should be break. This has to be changed, and there has to be support to the secular voices of Afghanistan, because we believe our experience in Afghanistan with RAWA and with such organization in Afghanistan has showed that women's emancipation, people's emancipation or freedom from occupation is only possible with secular struggle in whatever it is, even if it's very small, but it is there and it needs. And again, our experience has showed in Afghanistan that when RAWA had the support of international, not international organization, I don't mean by those big, but feminists and individuals and really those who cared for Afghanistan. So we had a big a circle of supporters from Japan to Canada to Australia to Spain, Italy, America, Canada, so everywhere. And then RAWA had also voice internationally, and also had a lot of activities, educational activities, political awareness, organization, publications. You talked about the documentation of crimes, which is very important. And one of RAWA's contribution, in fact, has been this, that in very, very dangerous situation, they have documented. You may have seen this scene of a woman shot dead by the Taliban in Kabul in sports stadium. So that was RAWA members who filmed that scene by taking risks with their lives, but because it was important to show that what was happening. So it's really important for us. This has been really important, that support to secular voices, anti-occupation, anti-fundamentalist voices is very important. But how we can do it, it's really a question. But the internet, of course, I mean, this communication and this technology has really made it easier. Maybe we can be in contact and make a group of people, and so.
Great, thank you so much. I'm aware that we are running out of time quite badly, but if you want to respond for 30 seconds, if you want to add something or respond to somebody, I'm taking the chair's privilege to giving ourselves a bit of extra time. I like extensions. Or any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
I actually didn't have a question, or more an adding to what you said before about the solidarity, because you spoke about your occupations are kind of alike. I think an important point to make is not only to look at the at the suffering of you, but also what the oppressor is causing, and their links together, because they cooperate. India and Israel are cooperating in the oppression of Kashmir and Palestine, and I think that is very important to look at. A big part of the of Israel's production of weapons are sold to India. They test them in Gaza and then they sell them to India to use them to crush the resistance in Kashmir. So it's important on all levels. That's
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you again for the participants. Very sorry we had so little time. I would love to hear more from you, but I think we got some really interesting insights into how occupation is connected to neoliberalism, the human rights regime, in international development infrastructure, and heteropatriarchal nationalism and militarism, and we had some ideas, and we started this conversation about how we can start working together across the different sites, because there's so many common causes and common ideas. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, and thank you again for this.